Nature versus nurture. Welcome to Philosopher's Corner. I'm John. Nature versus nurture. It's one of the classic fundamental questions of philosophy. Is a person and their personality and who they become more a result of their biological genetics and how they're born, or is it more a result of the environment that they grow up in and the events that they experience? It's been a long debate reaching back, I think, really to like the 1600s it really started. And it's been a classic question because people just want to know, are you born who you are and you have these traits that you inherit and you have the level that you're at and that's who you are? Or is it more, oh, you got born into a particular situation and then that situation forms you more than how you were born, of who you were? And throughout the years, there have been strong arguments on both sides. And they really talk about the biological genetics a lot. Like, oh, you were born to this family, so you do the genetics and you go, oh, well, you have these abilities, you have this mental level, you have this physical level, you have these performance features, and you have these inclinations, you have this health span, all those sorts of things, which definitely reduces the human experience to some sort of mechanical metrics. And then you have a side that says, okay, if you get born at a certain socioeconomic level, if you get born in civilization, if you get born in the wild, those are really going to make you who you are, right? And of course, it's a sophisticated world, so of course it's going to be a mix of both. And then to throw into that mix, which doesn't get talked about too often, is Plato's assertion that souls have different levels. He famously talked about there's gold souls, silver souls, and bronze souls, and they do have different levels, and they have different dimensions, essentially, that they get to operate in, and they have different levels that they live on, which doesn't get taken into account a lot in this particular philosophical debate / question. So we've got examples from both sides, right? I mean, famously in human history, you have somebody like Moses, right? He famously in the Bible, his parents know he's of the highest level genetics, and that they assume that he has this because of his high level genetics and predispositions. They believe that he's destined to be a ruler of a great many people, no matter what his circumstances are. And so in his story, they famously put him in a basket and send him down the river, where he's adopted in the normal general public. And they have full faith that because of his genetics, that he's going to rise up. I mean, they also have a spiritual belief in him. But the evidence of his biological constitution is what they really had faith in him in terms of the material world. So when they sent him down the river, they knew that wherever he ended up, they believed that he was going to be guided by God and that the universe and divine flow is going to give him opportunities, but they felt that his biological makeup was of such high caliber that he was going to be able to engage in any particular like lower class obstacle and overcome his nurturing, overcome his environment and then rise back up to the level. And that turned out to be true. And we have lots of examples throughout human history of that occurrence, where someone whose hereditary inheritance, their biological makeup, their skills and abilities even though they get put into certain environments, they're not commensurate to those, they rise up. And the environment affects them and they learn things, but it doesn't, sometimes it changes the core of who they are, it informs them, but ultimately they rise to the level. I mean, even Buddha is an example of a guy who, you know, he's born as a prince and royalty and all that, and then eventually he takes himself out because he makes a determination that for his enlightenment to occur, or for some, at the point, probably just general edification and like life experience, that he was being nurtured in a way that he felt was incompatible but with his whole person development, living inside the palace walls and only seeing perfection and whatnot. He decided that for his own whole person development, he needed to get outside the palace walls and go out and let the environment in all its complexities form him. And he's an example of, he rose to heights that he couldn't have even imagined if he had just stayed in the palace walls, where seemingly he had everything. And it wasn't until he left everything behind that he actually was free to be connected to everything and to gain his enlightenment. And then you have stories of, you know, horrible stories of people born into abusive families where their parents abused them from an early age. You know, all manner of abuse, like physical, psychological, sexual, some of it intentional, a lot of it intentional, malevolent, where the parents turned on their child and intentionally inflicted harm. And then they lived in an environment where there was still more harm going on. It was a very low level of the reality, a coarse level of the reality, so there was no respite. So they'd be abused at home and then go out into public, and the public was not much better, you know, be it slums or just general hellholes. And, you know, many of those people, due to the extreme handicapping and debilitating and the abuse causing the non-development of that person, made it so that it negated any of the good genetics or the good parts of their constitution of them as a person that might have been able to develop. And that happens all over the place. Many people are born in areas where there's famine or starvation or general corruption, and they don't even really get a fair shot to boot up their body, to get their body going. And at that point, it's very clear that for many people, the nurture aspect of their environment was so extreme a limiting factor that you almost can't even rightly say that their nature side even got a chance. And so how does that factor into nature versus nurture, right? Like when you realistically don't even get a chance to find out if your nature can overcome the environment in these lower realms. And that's real life. That's happening right now to somebody. That happens all over the place. And so in that sense, you know, I think the philosophical analysis of that is that that's a man-made problem. Corruption, abuse, all these things. When external forces are acting to prevent somebody from exploring their nature, from developing their nature, and I don't mean that in a Western decadent way of like all of these particular like very refined choices and all of these sort of deviancies of expressions of like extreme extensions of character and different things. I mean, in the very core, straightforward center universally agreed upon human aspects of developing nature, of like, oh, you can grow up to 7 years old without somebody trying to rape you. Oh, you can grow up knowing that you're going to get fresh water and a place to sleep and food and some education and training on how to develop your intellect and open your heart and engage with your community and learn about a community and learn about being a human being. And like, you get a relative chance to actually develop your body and have your soul come into your body. All the psychological studies say, and this is a well-known fact, that early childhood development mainly takes till about 7 years of age. And from 0 to 7 is the most sensitive and important part of the development phase, because all of the internals are booting up and all of the ability to find yourself is starting to take place. And then, of course, there's another bump, in puberty, and then really a person doesn't really become like a mature person operating with all their cards, so to say, until around 25, which is when the fuller development of the prefrontal cortex occurs around the age of 25, and that's generally when you become mature, and that's when you can start to actually have like a fully comprehensive worldview. Now, external factors impeding extreme development before the age of 7, those are generally man-made, that make it so that people can't even really get into their life. So to use them as part of the nature versus nurture debate is not really in the spirit of it. That's sort of a different discussion, right? In the same way that if somebody on the other end like is very rich and they don't have to deal with anything and they get all this, right, that can equally screw them up. Now you could say that, well, that's just part of environmental factors, right? Well, they are, but that's not in the ideal state of talking about this particular issue. In this particular issue, it's more in a common sense way, more, okay, maybe you're lower, maybe you're higher, but you don't have extreme factors taking you out of the game one way or the other, like taking you out of allowing nature to develop you, like allowing at least a somewhat healthy development. So in this debate, if we're saying that someone had an abusive or they had a development that disallowed their normal development, I think that's a different issue. Now, I know a lot of people like to say that that's still included. Well, the nature of this, the nature of that. Well, it's like, well, if you're born in a Holocaust camp, okay, what are you really saying then? Like, okay, if you're 5 years old and people are bombing your house, can you really like put that person under the scope of nature versus nurture? I don't think you can. I think that's a different dimension. It's an extreme dimension. And here's the thing, there are still people that rise up out of those situations, and they're amazing people. So it's not 100% that those people get wiped out. So in terms of the nature side, the fact that anybody can survive those basically hell realms and come out as awesome people is amazing. Because if you even get like one of those people to get out of there, that's like a really big check mark in the strength of nature, of the person developing their talents and skills that they inherited, and that they their God-given body and talents, right? But I don't think it's proper in terms of the intellectual weighing of this issue to allow people who are in obvious duress from other human beings applying immoral pressures on them to say, oh, well, you see, these people, they can't overcome their environment, so it must be they're defective in like their character, like from the birth, right? Like that's an improper analysis. So given people that don't have extreme obstacles to their development, we get a blend, right? There's a catalyzing effect that occurs. There's a chemistry, right? Where the character, I think what you're born with and who you are is more dominating in who you become than your nature. But the environment really has a really huge effect on you up until about age 7. And then like it starts to lessen a little bit as a person gets their sea legs and they start to figure out who they are and how they navigate through life. And really it's more appropriate to assess the nature versus nurture at that, in terms of what we're talking about. Because when people get a sense of self and faculty, then the majority of the time, when they start to get a sense of self and they get to start analyzing their relationship with the reality, with the environment that they're in, then most of the time I've seen that people can in fact overcome a lot of it if it's a negative environment. Now, there's plenty of people who live in neutral or positive environments, and then wow, then they can really make huge gains. They can really optimize who they are. They can really accelerate their evolution. A lot of growth, and they can really get into it. But even if those people, if they can survive the negative environment to the point where they can become autonomous and they can become somewhat self-aware, even then, that's when they can start to develop the relationship with the environment and then start to use it to propel themselves into the person they want to be. Now, do I think it's predetermined? Absolutely not. Do I think that the inherited traits, your genetics, your biology, and whatnot, do I think that gives you your operating parameters? Yeah, for sure. 100%. As I sit here, when I was growing up, when I was early childhood and I was starting to assess myself and like who I was and what my abilities were in general, there were things that I knew that were never going to happen for me. I could look at my parents and determine genetics and this and that, and like, I knew I was never going to be the fastest man on the planet. At no point in my life did I dream of being the 100-meter sprint champion. Never happened. And there's a whole list of other things like that where early on I was, oh, well, okay, that's not a thing that I have the ability for. I was never going to be the starting center for the Los Angeles Lakers. I was, there was just all sorts of things. I was never going to be a guy that spoke 50 languages, foreign languages. And by figuring out all those things, then I figure out, okay, these are the things I'm good at. And then once I started to become self-aware about the things I was good at and dealing with all sorts of things in my environment, which some of the negative things in my environment brought my attention to what my abilities were, because then I found out I have an ability to overcome that, or I don't have an ability to overcome that thing that I like or don't like. And then, oh, why do I like or don't like it? Well, maybe my liking or don't liking this thing in my environment is related to my ability to deal with it, which is related to what my character is and what my abilities are and what my perceptions are. And it really just comes back to me. And maybe I don't like it because I don't feel like I'm in control of that relationship, or maybe I don't like it because it is an actual danger or threat to me and it has nothing to do with my ability to handle it, so I'll steer away from it. So in that very visceral way, the environment absolutely shapes us. So both these things are happening. The debate is really which one's more dominant. And I think where I'm landing at is, because it's a blend, everybody admits it's a blend. Nobody says it's 100% one or the other. But where I'm landing at is early childhood development, the environment can really, that actually changes who you actually are. Like, because once you get to around like 7 to 13, then the pool balls are kind of racked, right? But up until 7, the environment had a real chance to like really actually change the nature of who you are. They always say in the nature nurture, they always say, well, the nature is all hereditary genetics and da 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 da. But really, from like 0 to 7, the nurture, the environment really gets to throw some stuff in there that almost de facto is sort of contributing to who you are, because you have almost no ability to like really do anything about it. So in a way, it's almost part of your gestation process, because as we can see from psychology, 0 to 7, early childhood development, not really far off par from development in the womb or the hereditary things you've inherited up to 7. So the environment is almost affecting your genetics at that point in an unfiltered way as much as your parents' biological creation of you, right? And that's even excluding just the spiritual side or the deeper inner life that's occurring. So up until 7, the environment is inputting in a way comparable, in my opinion, to the genetics that are involved. And then really, you know, from around 7 or 13, somewhere in there, when a person starts to get their faculties, I think that's really when the debate really should kick in, right? Because it's not just strictly a genetic inheritance on the nature side. It's really, you're asking when the person starts to have self-aware faculties, which is in part controlled by the environment or catalyzed by the environment, but is more so just by the universal human psychological development factors, which are orthodox and well established and studied throughout Earth and throughout timelines. So I think once a person gets a little bit older and they can display some self-awareness, then it's fair to ask that question, because the environment for sure can negate any sort of development. We see that throughout the animal kingdom. You know, I mean, when you see a leatherback turtle lay 1 million eggs and then they take off and then they hatch and they try to, the little baby, you know, turtles try to get out to the ocean, you know, most of them don't make it, right? So what was the character of those little sea turtles before they, you know, before some bird ate them, right? Like, oh, well, can you even really like register them in there? Was it nature versus nurture that they got ate within 30 seconds of being hatched? You know, like, can you, like, where do you start really doing the analysis on it? And I think that you really got to wait for humans. I really think 0 to 7 should be more lumped into, it's more on the side of your genetic inheritance than it is on the side of who your character is, because you don't even really have self-awareness yet. You don't have psychological development. And so the environment of that portion is more just directly affecting your DNA and your development than the question itself poses, because the question itself really has this implication that you're a self-aware being who has control of your faculties, and that you're interacting with your environment to a degree that you have some faculty or agency, which when you study children, you know that's simply not true. It's physically impossible for them up until they reach the completion of their early childhood development. Then they start getting spatially oriented. Then they start being able to have a concept of reality and environment. And then at that point, I think the question is applicable. Okay, once a person has displayed some level of self-awareness, then are we talking nature versus nurture? Because before, I really think the nature it's really more on par with your genetic inheritance. And I know that doesn't really get brought up a lot, but that's really how I feel about it. And then it's a blend, and then it's a dance of life. Then it's okay, because it's a thing that as a human being, it's a thing that a human being can go back into and review and change their relationship with. So you could be, you know, it's like Citizen Kane. You could be a powerful mogul, and it takes you a lot of your life to go back and realize the events in your early childhood that affected your psychological state for the rest of your life. But you can always go back and change your perspective on it as an adult. You can take your mature perspective and go back to your childhood, and you can't change the events that happen, but you can change your perspective in relation to it. That's a thing we can do as humans. And so in that sense, we can use our character and our nature with enough time to develop a relationship with any of the environments that have shaped us and incorporate them and integrate them. How, like Carl Jung says, in the process of individuation, you got to integrate all of everything. And that comes from your nature. That does come from who you were born to be and who you've developed yourself as you go through life. And it's a flowing, evolving situation. And I think that analysis begins once a person really becomes some level of self-aware of what they're going through. And then it's a fair question to ask. And I think it's a question that every person, I think we're all universally geared to make that assessment as we go through life, being aware of who we are and what our environment was and how it shaped us, and then coming to grips with it and integrating it. But that's all driven by who we are internally and what we've inherited with our abilities. So, nature versus nurture. Well, I hope you found this helpful. Thanks for spending some time here at Philosopher's Corner, and I hope you have a good day.